My name is Noti Lua, and I am 69 years old. And on the afternoon my son told me I was too old to keep my own money. I was standing in my own kitchen with a bowl of rice in my hands. Mom is too old to keep that money anyway, Hoa said. He did not say it to me. He said it to her, Tungi, standing beside him in her white blouse and her painted nails. But he said it loud enough that the words landed on me like stones dropped into still water. He said it the way you say something you have rehearsed, something you have practiced saying without flinching. My son, 36 years old, the only child I carried for 9 months and raised alone after his father died, stood in the doorway of the house his father and I built with our own hands, and he said I was too old. I did not drop the bowl. I want that understood. My hands did not shake. I set the rice down on the table, slowly, the way I used to measure powders on the old brass scale at the pharmacy, where even a grain too much could turn medicine into poison. Then I smiled. Just a small smile, one corner of my mouth, the kind of smile I used to give customers who tried to argue with me about the price of their prescriptions when I already knew, before they finished speaking, exactly how the conversation would end. Nhi looked at me strangely. She had expected tears, I think. She had expected the old woman to crumble, to beg, to ask what she had done wrong. Instead, I only stood there in the gray afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, the light catching the silver in my hair, the light catching the smoke still curling up from the incense on my husband's altar in the next room, and I said nothing at all. The silence confused them more than any argument could have. Koa shifted his weight. He glanced at Ngi, and Ngi glanced back at him, and for one moment neither of them knew what to do with a woman who would not fight. They had come prepared for a fight. Ngi had a folder tucked under her arm, thick with papers, and I already knew, the way I used to know a bad prescription just by the smell of it, that whatever was inside that folder was not going to be good for me. But I did not ask to see it, not yet. I only turned back to the stove, lifted the lid on the pot of bitter melon soup I had been cooking since noon, and let the steam rise up and fog my glasses for a moment so that neither of them could read what was in my eyes. 40 years I spent behind the counter of my pharmacy, 40 years reading people's faces the way other people read newspapers. A mother who came in nervous, refusing to meet my eyes, was hiding a fever she was scared to admit. A husband who bought sleeping pills for his wife and would not look at me at all, that was a different kind of fear, and I learned, over the decades, never to ignore it. My husband used to tease me. He would say, "Lua, you don't sell medicine. You interrogate people first and heal them second." He was not wrong. I built that habit slowly, prescription by prescription, year by year, until it became something under my skin, something I could not turn off even now, even standing in my own kitchen while my only son told his girlfriend I was too old to be trusted with my own life. Too old. As if age were a disease with no cure. As if the woman who once calculated dosages down to the milligram, who once caught a young pharmacy assistant trying to swap the labels on 2 bottles of medication because it was cheaper to sell the wrong one, had suddenly, at 69, forgotten how to count. I let them think what they wanted to think. That evening, after they left, Koa kissing my cheek quickly at the door, the way you kiss someone you are trying not to look at too closely, and Ngi offering me a bright, empty smile that did not reach her eyes, I sat alone in the front room, across from my husband's photograph. The incense had burned down to ash. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into old wooden houses at night, when the wind moves through the tamarind tree outside and makes the shutters creak like an old man clearing his throat. I looked at my husband's face in the photograph. He was smiling in that picture the way he always smiled, a little crooked, a little amused, as if he already knew something the camera did not. We built this pharmacy together, this house together, this life together, coin by coin, prescription by prescription, through years when neither of us had enough to spare, and we saved anyway, because saving was the only promise we could make each other about tomorrow. 41 years of marriage. 8 years since he left me, and in those 8 years, alone in this house with his photograph and his old reading glasses still sitting on the shelf where he left them, I had never once told our son exactly how much we had saved. Not the number. Never the number. My husband used to say, "A wound doesn't get better because you keep touching it to see if it still hurts," and money was the same. Better to keep the number close, quiet, folded away like an old letter you don't need to read again to remember what it says. But Hoa knew there was money. Everyone in the family knew there was money. And now there was a folder under Engi's arm, and there was a voice in the kitchen that said I was too old, and there was something moving now, something I could feel the way I used to feel a storm coming before the sky ever changed color, back when I was a girl in the Delta, and my grandmother would look at the horizon and say the water was already deciding what it would do to us. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dark long after the candle at the altar burned low, listening to the wind pull at the tamarind leaves outside, listening to the old house breathe the way old houses do, settling into itself, patient, unbothered by time. My grandmother used to say something to me when I was small, back when the war made everyone afraid and afraid people say true things without meaning to. She would take my hand and she would say, "Still water runs deepest, Con. The river that makes no sound is the one you should never turn your back on." I did not understand her then. I was 7 years old, and I only wanted to go outside and play. I understood her now. So when my son called me too old, when my son's girlfriend looked at me with that folder tucked under her arm like a knife hidden in a sleeve, I did not raise my voice. I did not demand to see what was written on those papers. I only smiled and let the water stay still and waited, the way I had always waited, for the moment when stillness would tell me everything I needed to know. Before I tell you what happened next, you should know who I was before all of this. You should know the woman I used to be, back when my hands smelled of alcohol swabs and paper envelopes instead of grief. I met my husband, Duke, in the autumn of 1979, in the back room of a small pharmacy where I had just started my apprenticeship. I was 22 years old, thin as a reed, with a braid down my back and a stubbornness my mother despaired of. Duke was 26, already trained, already trusted with the difficult prescriptions, the ones that required a careful hand and a careful mind. He did not speak much in those days. He watched. He counted pills with a precision that made the older pharmacists nod with respect. And when he finally spoke to me, 3 weeks after I started, it was only to correct the way I was measuring a tincture. "You're pouring too fast," he said. "Medicine is not water. It does not forgive haste." I was annoyed. I remember that clearly, the small hot flare of pride in my chest, but I slowed down. And he was right, of course, the way he was right about most things in that quiet, unhurried way of his. And within a year we were married in my mother's courtyard under a tent made of borrowed cloth, with fewer guests than either family would have liked, because it was a hard time, and hard times do not care about weddings. We opened our own pharmacy 6 years later, after saving every dong we could spare, after living for 2 years in a single room behind someone else's shop so we would not have to pay rent anywhere else. I remember the day we hung the sign above the door. Duke painted the letters himself, careful and slow, the same way he measured tinctures, and when he finished, he stepped back and looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and I understood that he was too moved to speak, and I loved him more in that silence than I had loved him in all the words he had ever said to me. This house, the one I still live in, the one with the tamarind tree in the front yard, and the altar in the front room, we built 4 years after that, plank by plank, tile by tile, whenever the pharmacy made enough extra for us to add one more piece. The floor in the kitchen is uneven in one corner, because Duke insisted on laying it himself instead of hiring someone properly trained, and I used to tease him about it every time I dropped something, and it rolled toward that low spot like a stubborn little joke between us. I never let anyone fix it. Even now, Hoa was born in the room that is now my bedroom, in the hour before dawn, with the midwife shouting at Duke to boil more water, and Duke so nervous he boiled far more than anyone needed. I remember holding my son for the first time, tiny and furious and red-faced, and looking up to see Duke crying without any shame at all, standing in the doorway in his undershirt with his hands still damp, and thinking, this is what a good life looks like. This exact moment. I did not know yet how many other moments would come, easy ones and hard ones, but I knew that one, right then, was worth everything we had given up to have it. We raised Koa in that house together. Duke taught him to ride a bicycle in the lane outside, running behind him with one hand hovering an inch from the seat, ready to catch him and never quite catching him because Duke believed a boy needed to fall sometimes to learn balance. I taught Hoa his letters at the kitchen table, the same table where, decades later, his girlfriend would stand with a folder under her arm. I taught him to count using pills from the empty medicine trays, red for tens, white for ones, and he was good with numbers even then, quick and clever, and I remember feeling so proud of that cleverness, never once imagining a day when his cleverness might be turned towards something other than helping people. We were not wealthy people. I want to say that clearly, because I think sometimes when people hear the word pharmacist, they imagine something grander than what we had. We were comfortable. We were careful. Every year, after the pharmacy's expenses were paid, after Choa's school fees, after the small repairs the house always seemed to need, we set aside what remained, not lavishly, not all at once. A little in a passbook account, a little more when a good year allowed it, and Duke used to sit at this same kitchen table on the last evening of every lunar year, going over the numbers with his reading glasses pushed low on his nose, and he would look up at me and say the same thing every single year, like a small ritual between us. Enough for tomorrow, Lua. Not much, but enough. He died 8 years ago in the spring, quietly, in his sleep, the kind of death that people call peaceful and that I have never fully believed was peaceful, because I woke that morning and reached for him out of 41 years of habit, and found only stillness where his warmth should have been. I did not scream, I remember that too. I simply sat there for a long time with my hand on his chest, feeling the cold settle into a house that had never been cold before. Not once, not in all the years we filled it with 2 voices instead of 1. I built the altar in the front room myself, in the spot where the afternoon light comes through the window and touches the photograph just so, around 4 o'clock, the way Duke always liked to sit in that exact patch of sun with his tea. I burn incense there every morning and every evening, a habit so old now that my hands do it without my mind needing to be present at all. I still set his teacup out sometimes, foolishly, the way you keep talking to someone after they have left the room, because 41 years does not simply end because a heart stops. After he died, I kept the pharmacy running for 2 more years, until my knees would not allow the long hours anymore, of who Duke and I had once been. I gave Choa his father's old wristwatch, and his father's fountain pen, and I gave him, without ever telling him the exact figure, the understanding that someday, when I was gone, everything else would be his too. That is simply how it is done. That is simply how families work, or how I always believed they worked, back before I learned there are other ways a family can end. I never imagined I would need to protect what Duke and I built from the one person we built it for. But that is getting ahead of myself, and my grandmother taught me long ago that a story told too quickly loses its truth along the way. I only tell you this now, this quiet history of 2 young pharmacists and a house raised board by board, so that you understand what exactly was standing in that folder Engi carried under her arm. It was not paper. It was 40 years. And 2 nights after that afternoon in the kitchen, I would learn just how much of it Choa was already planning to take. 2 nights after that afternoon in the kitchen, Choa came back alone. I heard his motorbike before I saw him, that particular rattle in the engine he had been promising for months to get fixed, and I set down the shirt I was mending and went to open the door before he could knock. He stood on the step with his hands in his pockets, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked like the boy who used to come home from school with a torn knee, and a story about how it happened that never quite matched the wound. "Can I come in, Mom?" I stepped aside. Of course I stepped aside. He was still my son, whatever else was folding itself quietly into motion around him. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I taught him his letters, and I made tea because that is what you do, because the ritual of pouring and waiting gives a person something to do with their hands while their mind works. He did not bring up Ngi. He did not bring up the folder. He talked instead about his business, about a piece of land near the new highway extension that was about to triple in value, about a partner who needed capital fast and would pay it back within the year with interest that made my eyebrows lift despite myself. "It's a sure thing, Mom. I've seen the paperwork. I've seen the zoning approval. I have spent 40 years listening to people describe things as sure. Sure that a headache was nothing. Sure that the chest pain would pass on its own. I learned long ago that the word sure, spoken too quickly, too eagerly, is usually covering for something the speaker has not looked at closely enough, or does not want to. How much capital, I asked, does your partner need? He told me a number. It was not a small number. It was, in fact, very close to half of what Duke and I had spent 40 years setting aside, though Choa did not know I knew that. because I had never told him the figure, not once, not even after his father died. I did not say yes. I did not say no either. I told him I would think about it. And I watched something flicker across his face, quick as a moth against a lamp, gone before I could name it. Disappointment, maybe, or something colder than disappointment. He left before 9. I sat alone at the table for a long while after, turning his cup in slow circles, watching the last of the tea leaves settle at the bottom. The following week, I went to the market as I always did on Tuesday mornings, along the same route I had walked for 30 years, past the flower stall where the old woman always saved me the freshest chrysanthemums for the altar, past the tailor's shop where the sewing machines clattered like insects behind the open shutters. It was an ordinary morning. The sky was pale and high, the kind of sky that promises heat later but gives you mercy in the meantime. I stopped at the small branch of the bank, where I had kept my passbook account for 11 years, ever since the larger bank downtown closed its neighborhood office and everyone shifted their savings to wherever was convenient. I wanted only to check the balance, a habit as old as the account itself, something I did every few months the way another woman might check the water level in a well she depended on. The young clerk behind the counter, a girl I did not recognize, new perhaps, typed my account number and frowned at her screen in a way that made my stomach tighten before I understood why. "I'm sorry, Auntie," she said. "There was a withdrawal 3 weeks ago, quite a large one." The room did not spin. I want to be precise about that, because there is a way people describe shock in movies, dramatic and dizzying. And that is not how it happened to me. Everything simply became very still and very sharp, the way the world sharpens right before a storm breaks, when the leaves stop moving entirely and the birds go silent all at once. "How large?" I said. She turned the screen toward me. 60 million dong, withdrawn on a Thursday, 3 weeks earlier, under my account, with my signature on the withdrawal slip. I had not been to this bank in 3 weeks. I had not signed anything in 3 weeks. "May I see the slip?" I said, and my voice came out steady, the way it always came out steady in the pharmacy, even on the mornings I had to tell a mother her child's fever was something more serious than a fever. The girl hesitated, then disappeared into the back and returned a few minutes later with a photocopy. The signature was mine. It was, at a glance, exactly mine, the same loop on the L, the same slant leaning slightly to the right the way my hand had always leaned since I was a girl learning to write with a fountain pen my own mother could not afford to replace if I broke the nib. But I had spent 40 years reading handwriting, prescriptions scrawled in a hurry by exhausted doctors, refill requests written by trembling elderly hands, forged notes from teenagers trying to buy medicine that required a guardian's permission. I knew handwriting the way a jeweler knows stone, and something in this signature was wrong in a way I could not yet name, something too even, too careful, like a photograph of my handwriting rather than my handwriting itself. "Was I here?" I asked the girl. "Do you have security footage from that day?" She looked uncertain, glanced toward the manager's office, then said she would need to check with someone senior. That these things took time. That I should perhaps come back tomorrow. I did not go back to the market that morning. I do not remember buying the chrysanthemums, though I found them in my bag later that evening, slightly wilted, and I do not remember the walk home either, only that I arrived at my own front door with my heart beating in a slow, controlled rhythm that felt more dangerous than if it had been racing. I sat that evening before the altar longer than usual. The incense smoke curled upward in thin gray ribbons, catching the last orange light through the window, and Duke's photograph watched me the way it always watched me, patient, a little amused, as if he already knew something the camera had captured but I had not yet learned to see. 60 million dong, gone 3 weeks ago, on a day I had not set foot inside that bank. I thought of Koa sitting at my kitchen table only days before, describing his sure thing, his zoning approval, his partner who needed capital fast. I thought of the number he had named, and how close it sat, uncomfortably close, to the number now missing from an account he was not supposed to know the balance of. I did not want to believe it. Let me be honest with you about that, because there is no dignity in pretending a mother's love turns off like a faucet the moment suspicion enters a room. I sat there wanting, with everything left in me, for there to be some other explanation, a clerical error, a different Ngo Ti Lua somewhere in the district, some coincidence of names. but I had spent 40 years learning not to trust wanting over evidence. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would go back to that bank, and I would not leave until someone showed me that security footage, and I would look, very carefully, at whoever it was standing at that counter wearing my name like a borrowed coat. Because whoever it was, they had learned how I write my letters by watching me for years, and there were only so many people who had watched me that closely. I went back to the bank the next morning before it even opened, standing outside the metal shutters with my bag clutched against my chest like a woman waiting for a doctor's office to unlock its doors. The street was quiet at that hour, just a few motorbikes idling at the noodle stall on the corner, steam rising into the cool morning air, the smell of broth and fish sauce drifting past me while I waited. When the shutters finally rolled up, I was the first one inside. The manager, a heavyset man named Mr. Tuan, whom I had known for years, the kind of polite, distant knowing that comes from exchanging pleasantries across a counter for over a decade, greeted me with the careful concern of someone who had already been warned I was coming. The young clerk must have told him. He led me into a small back office with a single window and a desk cluttered with folders, and he did not waste time on tea or small talk, which told me more than his words did. "Auntie Lua," he said, "I want you to know we take this very seriously." "Show me the footage," I said. He hesitated only a moment before turning his computer screen toward me. The video was grainy, the color washed pale by the bank's old fluorescent lighting, but clear enough. A woman stood at the counter, her back mostly to the camera, wearing a straw hat pulled low and a cardigan the color of weak tea, the kind of nondescript brown that 100 women in this town might own. She moved the way an older woman moves, slightly stooped, unhurried, and for one disorienting second I almost believed I was watching myself, some version of me I did not remember being on a Thursday 3 weeks past. Then she turned her head slightly to speak to the teller, and I saw, for less than 2 seconds, the edge of her jaw, the curve of her cheek beneath the hat's shadow. It was not me, the bones were wrong. My face has softened and hollowed with age in places this woman's had not, and there was a smoothness to her skin, a tautness at the throat, that 69 years does not leave behind. "That is not me," I said. Mr. Tuan nodded slowly, as if he had already suspected as much but needed to hear me say it aloud before the words could become official. "We suspected forgery once your account was flagged. I'm very sorry, Auntie. This kind of thing, it happens more than people realize. Someone studies a signature, sometimes for months, sometimes even from photocopies of old documents. With the right materials, a good forger can be very convincing on paper, but the camera does not forgive the way a signature can." I asked him to play it again, and again. Each time, I watched her hands rather than her face, because hands, I have learned, tell you more about a person's age and habits than almost anything else. Her hands moved quickly across the counter, sliding documents forward, signing with a confidence that did not match the practiced, cautious shuffle of an elderly woman uncertain of her balance. These were young hands wearing an old woman's cardigan. "Do you have footage from the parking area?" I asked. "Anyone who might have driven her here or waited outside." He pulled up a second file, grainier still, black and white, the camera angled toward the small gravel lot beside the bank. For a long moment there was nothing, just a stray dog trotting through the frame, the shimmer of morning heat already rising off the concrete. Then, at the very edge of the screen, a car pulled in, silver, unremarkable, the kind of car you see 100 of on any street in this town. It idled there for the 11 minutes the woman in the straw hat was inside, engine running, and then, when she emerged and climbed into the passenger seat, the car pulled away too quickly for the plate to resolve into anything but a blur. But I did not need the plate. I recognized the small dent above the rear wheel well. The kind of dent you get from backing carelessly into a gate, the kind of dent I had scolded my own son about only 2 months earlier, when he showed up at my door with exactly that damage on exactly that car, laughing it off, telling me not to worry. "Mom, it's just a scratch." I sat very still in that small back office, the hum of the old ceiling fan the only sound, and I said nothing for what felt like a long time. Mr. Tuan cleared his throat gently. "Auntie, would you like us to file a report? We can begin the process of freezing further activity on the account, and of course, you're entitled to full reimbursement once forgery is confirmed through investigation. It may take some weeks, but the bank does not simply— Not yet, I said. He blinked. Not yet? I need more time before anyone files anything. I do not fully know, even now, why I said those words instead of simply saying yes, report it, arrest whoever needs arresting. Perhaps some part of me was still hoping, foolishly, stubbornly, that I was wrong about the car, that there were 1,000 silver cars in this town with 1,000 identical dents, that the dark thread pulling tight in my chest was only an old woman's overactive suspicion and not the truth arranging itself in front of me piece by piece. Or perhaps I already knew, and simply was not yet ready to hold the knowing in my two hands. Mr. Tuan did not press me. He only nodded, the careful nod of a man accustomed to families protecting each other even against evidence, and he told me the footage would remain on file, untouched, for as long as I needed it. I thanked him. I walked out of that bank into a morning that had grown hot while I sat inside, the sun climbing high and merciless over the tin roofs of the market stalls, and I did not go home right away. Instead, I walked to the small shop 3 streets over where Duke and I used to buy our film developed, decades ago, before everything turned digital, a shop still run by the same family, now by the son of the man who once knew us both by name. I asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether he still did photo restoration work, whether he could take a blurred still frame from a video file and sharpen it, bring out details a screen alone could not show. He said he could try. He said it might take a day, maybe 2. I gave him the file Mr. Tuan had copied onto a small drive for me, and I walked home slowly under the climbing sun, past the flower stall, past the tailor's clattering machines, my mind circling the same dent in the same silver car over and over, unable to land anywhere solid. That evening, sitting before Duke's photograph with the incense burning low, I found myself thinking not of Koa at all, but of Nhi, of the folder she had carried under her arm that first afternoon, thick with papers I had never asked to see, and I began to wonder, with a coldness that frightened even me, whether that folder had already contained, from the very beginning, far more than I had ever imagined. The photo shop called me 2 days later, in the early afternoon, while I was hanging laundry on the line, strung between the tamarind tree and the corner of the house. I remember the wet weight of Duke's old shirt in my hands, the one I still wash out of habit though no one wears it anymore, and how my fingers went still against the damp cotton when the young man's voice on the phone said, "Auntie Lua, I think you should come see this yourself." I walked to the shop with my hair still damp at the temples from the afternoon heat, my sandals slapping against the pavement faster than my knees usually allowed. Inside, the shop smelled of old chemicals and dust, the smell of a business slowly being left behind by time, and the young man had the still frame already pulled up on his computer screen, enlarged and sharpened as much as his equipment allowed. It was the woman's face, not fully clear, not the way a photograph taken on purpose would be clear, but clear enough that I stood there for a long moment with my hand pressed flat against the counter, because I recognized her. It was Nhi, younger in the face than she appeared beside my son, her hair pulled back tighter, her jaw set in a way I had never seen her wear in my own kitchen, where she always kept her expression soft and agreeable, the expression of a woman auditioning for the role of a good daughter-in-law. But it was her. The shape of her nose, the particular height of her cheekbones, the small mole just beneath her left ear that I had noticed once while she poured tea for me and thought nothing of at the time. I thanked the young man, paid him more than he asked, and walked home in a kind of daze that had nothing to do with the heat. That night I did not sleep, and near midnight, unable to lie still any longer, I did something I am not proud of, though I do not regret it either. I went through the small basket by my door where I keep old receipts and unopened mail, and I found the business card Ingi had given me the very first time Koa brought her to the house, months ago, back when I still believed she might simply be a woman my son loved. Trin Bao Ngi. Financial consultant. A phone number, an email address, and beneath it, in smaller print, the name of a firm I had never bothered to look into, because why would a mother investigate her son's girlfriend, the way she once investigated whether a new supplier's medicine was genuine or counterfeit? The next morning I did what I should have done many months earlier. I asked Mrs. Hoa, who runs the small stationery stall near the market and who knows, I am convinced, more gossip than the district newspaper, whether she had ever heard of a financial consultant named Trin Bao Nhi. Mrs. Hoa's face changed the moment I said the name. Auntie Lua, she said, lowering her voice, though there was no one else near enough to hear. Is that the woman your son is seeing? My stomach folded in on itself. You know her? Not her exactly, but I know a name close to it. My cousin's daughter. She lost almost 30 million dong 2 years ago to a woman running some kind of investment scheme, promising returns that were too good, the way these things always are. My cousin's daughter never got her money back. The woman disappeared for a while, changed her business, I heard, started using a different name for a time. I only remember because my cousin's daughter cried in this very stall for an hour, right there where you're standing. What was the woman's real name? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Do you remember? Mrs. Hoa frowned, thinking. I don't remember the first name she used back then, but I remember thinking, when my cousin's daughter finally tracked down who she really was through a friend at the police station, that the woman had a strange kind of face, pretty, but cold underneath it, like a house that looks nice from the road but nobody's really living there. I asked her, carefully, if she could find out more. If her cousin's daughter might still have any paperwork, any photograph, anything at all that could tell me whether this woman and Ngi were one and the same, or whether I was simply an old woman chasing shadows out of fear and grief and the terrible ache of watching my son slip further away from the boy I raised. Mrs. Hoa promised to ask. She held my hand across the counter for a moment, the way women of my generation do when words are not enough, and told me to be careful. Auntie, these people, once they've decided what they want, they don't stop easily. I walked home that afternoon past the bank where the forged signature had been discovered, past the alley where the silver car with the dented fender sometimes parked when Hoa visited, and I found myself standing for a long moment outside my own front gate, looking up at the house Duke and I built plank by plank, feeling for the first time in 8 years that the walls themselves might not be safe anymore. 3 days passed before Mrs. Hoa called me. Her vs, when I answered, had lost its usual sing-song warmth. It was flat, careful, the voice of someone delivering news she did not want to deliver. Auntie Lua, she said, my cousin's daughter found the old file. There was a photograph attached to the police report from 2 years ago, from the fraud complaint. She sent it to me on her phone this morning. And? My hand was already tightening around the receiver. It's her, Auntie. It's the woman you described. Different name in the file, but I compared it to a photo my niece took at your son's birthday party last year. The one you're in too. Do you remember? At the restaurant downtown? I remembered. Ngi sitting beside my son that evening, laughing at something he said, her hand resting on his arm, with an easy familiarity that had struck me, even then, as slightly too practiced for a relationship only a year old. The fraud case was dismissed, Mrs. Hoa continued, because the victim couldn't produce enough documentation, and the woman claimed the investments were legitimate, just unlucky. She was never charged with anything. But Auntie, my cousin's daughter is certain. She's absolutely certain it's the same woman, same mole under the ear, same way of tilting her head when she smiles. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, looking through the doorway at the front room, at Duke's photograph on the altar, at the thin gray thread of incense smoke curling upward in the afternoon light, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, like a bone settling back into its socket, that the folder Ng had carried into my kitchen that first afternoon had never been about helping my son manage a piece of land near the highway extension. It had been about me, about what I had, about how much of it she believed she could take, and how carefully, patiently, she had already begun taking it. I thanked Mrs. Hoa and hung up the phone, and I stood there for a long time in the quiet house, my heart beating in that same slow, controlled rhythm I had felt in the bank days before, except now there was something else beneath it, something colder, something that had not been there when I only suspected a forged signature, because a forged signature is theft, but a woman who studies her victims for years, who changes her name and waits for the right family, the right son, the right lonely, grieving mother with a lifetime of savings folded quietly away, that is not simply theft. That is a plan. And I still did not know how much of it had already been set into motion, or how much further Koa had let himself be pulled into the center of it. I did not confront anyone that week. I want you to understand that this was a decision, not a hesitation. There is a difference between a woman who is afraid to act and a woman who is waiting for the ground beneath her feet to be solid enough to stand on. I had spent 40 years in a profession where a wrong conclusion, reached too quickly, could cost someone their life. I was not going to accuse my own son of anything until I had gathered every piece of proof this house could hold. So I became, in those weeks, something I had not been since the pharmacy closed. I became careful, methodical. I began keeping a small notebook, the kind Duke used to use for inventory counts, and in it I wrote down dates, times, small details that meant nothing on their own but might, together, mean everything. I started with the bank. I went back to Mr. Tuan and asked him, quietly, to print for me every transaction on my account for the past year, not just the 60 million that had already been discovered, but everything, down to the smallest withdrawal, the smallest fee. He looked surprised at first, then understanding. The way people understand when an old woman asks for more time and more paper, rather than less. What I found, when I sat at my kitchen table that evening with the printed pages spread in front of me like a hand of cards, was not one theft but a pattern of small ones, careful ones, spaced out over 8 months. A withdrawal here disguised as a fee. A transfer there routed through an account I did not recognize before eventually reaching one I did, an account under Koa's name that he had opened, according to the paperwork, only 10 months earlier. Small enough amounts, individually, that I might never have noticed them if I had not already been looking. Together, they came to nearly a quarter of everything Duke and I had saved. My grandmother used to tell me that bamboo bends in a storm so that it does not break, and I thought of that often in those weeks, sitting alone at my table with these pages of numbers, because I understood that I could not simply snap upright in fury and demand answers. If I did that, Hoa would see it coming, Ngi would see it coming, and whatever remained of what Duke and I had built would vanish before I could ever hold proof of where it had gone. I needed to bend. I needed to let the wind pass over me and appear, from the outside, unbroken and unaware, while underneath I was gathering everything the storm was trying to take from me. I began visiting the bank more often than usual, but never asking questions that would alarm anyone, only requesting statements, only asking Mr. Tuan, in the gentlest voice I could manage, to keep our conversations between the two of us for now. He agreed. I think he understood, better than I explained, that some wounds require quiet before they require action. I also went to see an old friend of Duke's, a retired police investigator named Mr. Fook, who had once helped us, years ago, when a supplier tried to pass counterfeit medicine through our pharmacy under forged certification papers. He was in his 70s now, slower in his steps, but his mind had not softened the way his knees had. I brought him tea, and the printed bank statements, and the photograph the young man at the photo shop had sharpened, and I told him everything, from the afternoon in the kitchen to the dented silver car, to Mrs. Hoa's cousin's daughter and her old fraud complaint. He listened without interrupting, the way good investigators do, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, turning the photograph over in his weathered hands. "You did the right thing, coming to me before going to your son," he said finally. "Most people, in your position, would confront the child first, out of love, out of hope that there's an explanation. But love makes people careless, Auntie Lua. And carelessness is exactly what people like this woman are counting on." He agreed to help me, quietly, unofficially, using contacts he still had from his years on the force. He would look into the fraud complaint Mrs. Hoa's cousin's daughter had filed 2 years earlier, see whether it had ever been properly closed, whether there were other victims who had simply never come forward. He would also, he said, look carefully at the bank transfers, see whether the account receiving the smaller withdrawals had any other unusual activity. Before I left his house that evening, he asked me one more question, one that stayed with me the whole walk home. "Has anyone asked you to sign anything recently? Anything at all? Even something that seemed unimportant?" I thought about it, standing there in his doorway with the evening light fading gold behind him, and then I remembered. 3 weeks earlier, only days before I discovered the missing 60 million, Hoa had brought over a stack of what he called household paperwork, insurance updates, something about renewing the deed registration on the house now that it was, as he put it, getting old enough to need review. I had signed several pages that afternoon without reading them closely. The way you sign things for your own child without suspicion. The way I imagine most mothers do. I told Mr. Fook this, and I watched something tighten behind his eyes. Do you still have copies of what you signed? I did not. Koa had taken everything with him that day, promising to bring back copies for my records, copies that, I realized now, had never arrived. Mr. Fook did not say anything alarming. He only nodded slowly, and told me he would look into the property registry office as well, quietly, using an old contact who still worked there, to see whether anything had been filed under my name in recent weeks. I walked home in the dark that night, the streetlights flickering on one by one along the lane, the tamarind tree outside my house, rustling in a wind that smelled faintly of rain not yet arrived. I sat before Duke's altar as I always did, lighting the incense, watching the thin smoke rise and bend and straighten again in the small currents of air moving through the room, bamboo in miniature, bending without breaking. 3 days later, Mr. Fook called. His voice, when I answered, had none of its usual patient calm. "Auntie Lua," he said, "I need you to sit down before I tell you what I found in the property registry." I sat down at my kitchen table with the phone still pressed to my ear, and Mr. Fook told me what his contact at the property registry had found. The deed to my house, the house Duke and I built plank by plank, tile by tile, over years of saving what little we could spare, had been transferred, 3 weeks earlier, into a limited power of attorney under Koa's name. The document authorized him, on my behalf, to manage, mortgage, or sell the property without requiring my presence for any future transaction. My signature was on it. The same signature that had appeared on the forged bank withdrawal, the same careful, two-even loop on the L that had first told me something was wrong. "There's more," Mr. Fook said, and his voice had the flat, careful weight of a man delivering news he wished he did not have to deliver. The power of attorney was filed alongside an application to use the house as collateral for a private loan. The loan has already been approved. If it goes through fully, the lender has the right to seize the property if repayment terms aren't met. I did not speak for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the tamarind tree, and somewhere down the lane a motorbike passed, ordinary sounds from an ordinary evening, while inside my chest something had gone very still, the way the delta goes still in the hour before a storm arrives. I thanked Mr. Fook, asked him to gather whatever documentation he could without drawing attention, and hung up the phone with hands that, for the first time in weeks, were not entirely steady. 2 days later, Koa came to the house without calling first, and this time he did not come alone. Ngi walked in beside him wearing a cream-colored blazer, her hair pulled back in a smooth, confident knot, carrying a leather folder far thicker than the one she had carried that first afternoon. She smiled at me the way she always smiled at me, warm on the surface, empty underneath, and I smiled back the same way I had smiled since the beginning, the small, closed smile of a woman giving nothing away. "Mom," Koa said, settling into the chair across from me at the table without waiting to be offered a seat. "We need to talk about the house." "What about the house?" "There's an opportunity, a really good one. A developer is interested in this whole stretch of the lane, wants to buy up several properties for a new project. If we move fast, we could get a price for this place that's higher than anything you'd get selling it on your own in 10 years. I folded my hands on the table and said nothing, waiting, the way I used to wait behind the pharmacy counter for a customer to finish explaining a symptom before I offered a single word of my own. Ngi opened the leather folder and slid several pages across the table toward me, her manicured nail tapping lightly at a line near the bottom of the first page. "We just need your signature here, Auntie Lua, to authorize Koa to negotiate on your behalf. It's a formality, really. You've already signed similar paperwork before, so this is just an extension of that same arrangement." I looked down at the page. It was, as I expected, another authorization, broader than the last, granting Koa full rights to sell the property outright, no ceiling, no condition, no requirement that any portion of the proceeds ever reach my hands at all. "I already signed something for you 3 weeks ago," I said quietly, "about the deed registration." Koa's expression did not so much as flicker. "This is different. This is about the sale itself. I don't remember agreeing to sell this house, Mom." His voice took on the particular patience people use with someone they have already decided is no longer capable of understanding them. You're 69. This house is old, it's falling apart in places, you're rattling around in it alone with nobody to help you if something happens. This is a good thing. This is us taking care of you. By selling the roof over my head. By making sure you're set up properly for whatever time you have left, Ngi said smoothly. And something in the way she said it, whatever time you have left, so calm, so rehearsed, sent a chill through me colder than anything the withdrawal slip or the forged deed had managed to produce. She said it the way you might describe managing an asset that was already, in her mind, nearly finished being useful. And where would I live, I asked, once this house is sold? There's a lovely retirement facility outside the city, Ngi said, pulling a glossy brochure from the same folder as though she had been waiting the entire conversation for exactly this moment. Clean, modern, other people your age, staff available around the clock. It's actually quite affordable. Considering. I understood, looking at that brochure, exactly what she meant by considering. Affordable, once the house was sold and most of what remained had already found its way into accounts that were not mine. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand that, because I know how these stories are often told, with the old woman finally breaking, finally shouting, finally letting fury spill out across the table. That is not what happened. I sat very still, the way I had learned to sit still through 40 years of difficult conversations, and I looked at my son's face, searching for some trace of the boy who used to fall off his bicycle in the lane outside while his father ran behind him, ready to catch him and never quite catching him. I did not find that boy. I found instead a man who had already decided, somewhere in the months I had not been watching closely enough, that his mother's usefulness had an expiration date, and that date had already passed. I'll think about it, I said, the same 3 words I had given him weeks earlier about his sure thing near the highway extension, and I watched, again, that same flicker cross his face, faster this time, more impatient. Mom, there isn't much time to think. The developer needs an answer by the end of the month. Then I'll think quickly. Ngi's smile thinned, just slightly, just enough for me to see beneath it for one unguarded second. And in that second I understood something I had not fully let myself believe until then. They were not asking. They had already decided this was happening, with or without my full understanding of what I was signing. The same way 60 million dong had already left my account. The same way a power of attorney had already been filed on a deed I had built with my own husband's hands. They left the papers on my table when they finally went, along with a pen, as though leaving it there might somehow will my signature onto the page through patience alone. I sat alone in the kitchen long after their car pulled away, the brochure for the retirement facility still lying face up beside the untouched pen, and for the first time since this had all begun, I felt something close to fear settle into my chest, heavy and cold, because I understood now how quickly the ground beneath me was disappearing, and how very little time I might actually have left to stop it. Mr. Fook came to my house himself, 2 days after that conversation at my kitchen table, carrying a plain manila envelope that seemed too thin to hold anything capable of doing what it eventually did to me. We sat at the same table where Hoa and Ing He had left their brochure and their pen. I had not moved either since they left. The pen still lay exactly where Ngi had set it down, and I found myself unable to touch it, as though it carried something contagious. Mr. Fook opened the envelope slowly, the way a doctor opens a folder before delivering results he already knows are bad. Inside were copies, certified copies, of the original power of attorney filed at the registry office, along with something new, something he had not mentioned on the phone. I want you to look at the date on this first document carefully, he said, sliding it toward me. I put on my reading glasses, the same pair I had used to check prescriptions for decades, and I looked. The filing date was 3 weeks before Koa had ever brought me the household paperwork to sign. 3 weeks before I had sat at this very table, signing pages I believed concerned insurance and deed registration, trusting my son the way I had trusted him since the hour he was born in the room that is now my bedroom. That's not possible, I said quietly. He didn't ask me to sign anything until after this date. I know, Mr. Fook said, which means the document filed at the registry wasn't the one you signed. Someone created 2 versions. One you saw and signed, likely something far more limited than what was actually filed. I sat with that for a long moment, the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, stirring the incense smoke from the altar in the next room into slow, uncertain spirals. "There's something else," Mr. Fuck said, and something in his voice made me look up sharply. My contact at the registry pulled the visitor log for the office on the day the falsified document was filed. 2 names signed in that morning as witnesses to the transaction, required by law when a power of attorney of this scope is filed on behalf of an elderly applicant who isn't present. He turned the log copy toward me. I recognized Engi's signature immediately, the same tilted, confident hand I had seen 100 times on cafe receipts and birthday cards. But it was the second name beside hers that made the room tilt, just slightly, the way a boat tilts when a wave you did not see coming finally reaches you. Zhang Vanhua, not merely aware, not merely benefiting from something Engi had orchestrated alone while my son stood at some careful, deniable distance. He had signed his own name as a witness to a document forging his mother's authorization to seize her own house. He had stood in that registry office, pen in hand, and put his signature directly beside the crime. I do not know how long I sat there without speaking. Long enough that Mr. Fuck reached across the table and gently took my hand, the way he might have done for Duke, an old friend comforting an old friend's widow through something no friendship should ever have to witness. "Auntie Lua," he said softly, "I'm so sorry. I did not cry. I want to tell you that honestly, because I have told you, throughout everything that came before this moment, that my hands did not shake and my voice did not break, and I want you to understand that something in me finally did break here, quietly, without sound, the way a bone can fracture cleanly beneath skin that never bruises." I thought of Koa at 5 years old, sitting on Duke's shoulders as they walked home from the pharmacy together in the evening light, his small hands gripping his father's hair, laughing at nothing, laughing simply because he was young, and the world had not yet given him any reason not to laugh. I thought of him at 10, bringing me flowers he had picked from the neighbor's garden without asking, presenting them to me with such pride that I never had the heart to tell him he had stolen them. I thought of him standing at his father's funeral 8 years ago, 28 years old, his composed face cracking open the moment they lowered the casket, the sound that came out of him then, raw and unguarded, a sound I had never heard from him before or since. That was my son. That was the boy Duke and I raised at this table, in this kitchen, in this house we built with our own hands, so that he would always have somewhere safe to come home to. And somewhere between that boy and the man who had signed his name beside a forgery, meant to take everything his father and I had spent our lives building, something in him had simply stopped being that boy at all, and I had not seen it happen. I had not seen it happen because a mother does not watch her own child the way I once watched a customer's face for the first small signs of illness. A mother trusts. A mother assumes love will hold, the way I had assumed, without ever once questioning it, that the love Duke and I poured into this house, into this family, into this one boy we were given, would be enough to keep him honest even when the money in front of him grew large enough to test that honesty. I looked at Duke's photograph through the doorway. The incense burned down now to a thin gray stub, the smoke barely rising at all, and I found myself speaking to him without meaning to, the words leaving my mouth in a whisper before I even realized I had opened it. "He signed it, Duke. He put his own name on it." The house did not answer me. It never does. But I sat there, in the settling quiet of that kitchen, Mr. Fuchs' hand still resting over mine, and I understood, with a grief so complete it felt almost like relief, that whatever remained of the boy I raised was no longer the person I needed to protect this house from. It was the man sitting across from me at this table days earlier, calling this theft an opportunity, calling my own eviction a good thing, calling NG's cold arithmetic taking care of me. Mr. Fuchs gathered the documents back into their envelope, careful, methodical, the way he must have handled evidence his whole career, evidence that ends marriages, ends families, ends the quiet, comfortable stories people tell themselves about the people they love. "What do you want to do now?" he asked gently. I looked past him, toward the front room, toward the photograph of the man who once painted our pharmacy's sign letter by careful letter, who once told me medicine does not forgive haste, who taught our son to ride a bicycle by running behind him and never quite catching him, trusting instead that the boy would learn to catch himself. "I want to finish what he already started filing," I said quietly. But properly this time, with the truth in my hand instead of a lie in his. Mr. Fook nodded slowly, and for the first time since he had opened that envelope, I felt something steady returning beneath the grief. Something old and familiar, the same stillness I used to carry behind the pharmacy counter, the stillness that let me hold a trembling mother's hand and tell her the truth even when the truth was hard, because the truth, however painful, was always the only thing strong enough to build anything real on top of it. Grief, I have learned, does not stay in one place for long if you refuse to let it settle. It moves, if you let it, into something with a shape and a purpose. And in the days after Mr. Fook showed me my son's signature beside a forgery, I did not allow myself the luxury of sitting still with my sorrow. I had done enough sitting still. Now there was work to do, and work, I have always found, is its own kind of medicine. I began by asking Mr. Fook to teach me exactly what a case like this would require, should it ever go before the police or a court. He explained it patiently, the way he must have once explained things to younger officers under his command. We would need the original forged bank withdrawal slip and the security footage identifying Nhi. We would need the falsified power of attorney and the registry visitor log bearing both her signature and Hoa's. We would need a formal handwriting analysis, something beyond my own trained eye, something a judge could not dismiss as an old woman's wounded imagination. And we would need, if possible, some accounting of where the money had already gone, some trail connecting the withdrawals to Nghi's history of doing precisely this to other families before mine. The handwriting analysis, I said. I know someone who can help with that. Duke and I had a friend from decades ago, a document examiner named Mrs. Schwan who had once worked with the provincial court system, verifying signatures on contested wills and disputed contracts before she retired to a quiet life raising orchids on the outskirts of the city. I had not spoken with her in nearly 6 years. Not since Duke's funeral. But some friendships survive silence, the way certain plants survive drought, dormant, but never truly dead. I called her on a Tuesday morning, and though her voice was older, softer at the edges than I remembered, she agreed to see me the following day. I brought her everything: the bank statements, the photocopy of the forged withdrawal slip, the falsified power of attorney, and, most precious of all, a stack of old letters and receipts bearing my genuine signature from years past, so she would have something honest to compare against something false. She spent nearly 2 hours with her magnifying loupe bent low over the pages, murmuring occasionally to herself, marking small notes in the margins. "This is a very good forgery," she said finally, sitting back and removing her glasses. "Whoever did this studied your hand for a long time. Months, probably, maybe longer, but it is still a forgery, Auntie Lua. The pressure changes are wrong. Real signatures carry hesitation, especially as we age. This one is too confident, too smooth. It was made by someone young, someone whose hand does not yet know what it feels like to grow tired holding a pen." She agreed to prepare a formal written analysis, the kind that could stand in a courtroom, and told me it would take her about a week to complete it properly. I thanked her, and before I left, she took both my hands in hers and told me something I have carried with me since. "Duke would be proud of you," she said. "Not for winning. For being patient enough to win properly." I spent the following days moving quietly through my own life, as though nothing had changed, because that, Mr. Fook had warned me, was essential. If Koa or Nghi sensed that I knew what I now knew, they might act faster, might rush the sale of the house before I had gathered enough to stop it cleanly, so I answered Koa's calls with the same vague, unhurried tone I always used. I told him I was still thinking about the papers on my table. I let Nghi believe, when she called once to check in with a warmth so practiced it made my skin crawl, that I was simply a slow, sentimental old woman weighing the decision to leave the only home she had ever known. Underneath that performance, I was building something else entirely. I made copies of every document Mr. Fook and Mrs. Zwan gave me and hid them in 3 separate places. The way Duke once taught me to store medication reserves in case of flooding or fire, never all in one location, never all vulnerable to a single disaster. One set stayed behind a loose board beneath the altar, a place only I ever touched, dusting and relighting incense there every morning and evening without fail. Another set I gave to Mrs. Hoa at the stationery stall, sealed in an envelope she agreed to hold without asking questions, because friendship, real friendship, sometimes means trusting without needing the full story. The third set I kept with Mr. Fook himself, who assured me he still had contacts within the district police, willing to review the case properly once we were ready. I also, quietly, began speaking with a lawyer, a serious young woman named Miss Trang, who Mr. Fook recommended, someone who specialized in elder financial exploitation, a term I had never once imagined would apply to my own life. She listened to everything with careful, unhurried attention, the way I once listened to patients describing symptoms that did not yet have a name, and when I finished, she told me plainly what the law allowed and what it did not, what evidence would matter most, what timeline we were realistically working within before the property sale Hua and Ingi were pushing could become difficult, perhaps impossible, to unwind. "You have a strong case, Auntie Lua," she said, "stronger than most families ever manage to build, because most people don't have your patience. Most people react. You've been documenting." I thought of my grandmother then, the woman who taught me that the river making no sound is the one you should never turn your back on, and I understood, sitting in Miss Trang's small office with its stacks of case files and its single window looking out over a busy street, that I had spent my entire life without realizing it training for exactly this kind of stillness. 40 years measuring dosages that could not be rushed. 40 years reading faces for the truth beneath the words people chose to say aloud. 40 years learning that the most dangerous moment in any crisis is the one where you act before you are ready, where you let fear or fury make your decisions instead of evidence. I was almost ready now. Mrs. Swan's analysis would be finished within days. Miss Trang was already preparing the paperwork we would need to file. Mr. Fook's contact at the police department had agreed, informally, to review everything once we brought it to him properly assembled. There was only one piece still missing. One thread I could not yet fully see the shape of, and it worried me more than anything else, because Mr. Fook had mentioned it almost in passing during our last conversation, his brow furrowed in a way I had not seen on him before. The loan Koa had already secured against the house, the one using the falsified power of attorney as collateral, had a repayment deadline attached to it. Mr. Fook had not yet been able to learn the exact date, only that the lender involved was not a bank at all, but a private individual known, in certain circles, for moving quickly and without much patience for delay. And on the evening I sat before Duke's altar, going over everything one final time in my mind, Mr. Fook called me with news that told me, in a voice tighter than I had ever heard from him, that whatever time I believed I still had left to prepare had just grown considerably shorter than any of us expected. The date arrived before I felt fully ready for it, the way important dates always seem to, no matter how much preparation precedes them. It was the first anniversary of Duke's death that fell within the lunar month, the small monthly remembrance I observed quietly every year, and this time I used it, deliberately, as the reason to gather everyone beneath my own roof. I called Hoa myself, 3 days beforehand, and told him I wanted him and Yi to come for the ceremony, to light incense for his father, to share the meal I would prepare. My voice, when I spoke to him, carried none of what I now knew. I had learned, over these past weeks, how to fold my anger into something small enough to hide behind an ordinary invitation. "Of course, Mom," he said, and I heard something like relief in his voice, the relief of a man who believed his mother's silence these past weeks meant she was slowly coming around to what he wanted. "We'll be there." I also invited 2 others, though I did not tell Hoa their names. Mrs. Schwan, who agreed to come as what I described only as an old friend of the family, and Mr. Tuan from the bank, whom I asked to attend as well, quietly, in his ordinary clothes rather than his uniform, so that nothing about the gathering would look unusual from the outside. The morning of the ceremony, I woke before dawn and prepared the altar the way I always did, wiping down Duke's photograph with a soft cloth, arranging fresh chrysanthemums from the flower stall, setting out his favorite dishes, the bitter melon soup, the grilled fish, the sticky rice he used to request every year on this day. The incense smoke rose in thin, steady ribbons through the morning light, and I stood before his photograph for a long moment before anyone arrived, speaking to him the way I often did now, quietly, in the privacy of an empty room. "Today," I told him, I finish what you would have wanted me to finish. Koa and Guy arrived just after 10, dressed appropriately for the occasion, Guy carrying a small offering of fruit that she set on the altar with practiced solemnity. Mrs. Xuan arrived shortly after, carrying a leather portfolio she set discreetly on the side table near the front window. Mr. Tuan came last, greeting everyone with polite, unremarkable warmth, the greeting of a family friend, rather than a bank manager, holding transaction records. We began, as tradition required, by lighting incense together before Duke's photograph. I watched Koa's face as he bowed before his father, and for one unguarded moment I saw something that might have been shame flicker across it, gone as quickly as it appeared. Ngi bowed beside him with practiced grace, murmuring something respectful, and I found myself wondering how many other families' altars she had bowed before in exactly this same posture, exactly this same false humility. We sat down to the meal I had prepared. The conversation moved through ordinary channels at first, Koa asking about my health, Ngi complimenting the soup, the kind of small talk that fills a table when everyone in the room is waiting for something else to begin. I let it continue for nearly 20 minutes, long enough that everyone had settled into the comfortable rhythm of an ordinary family gathering, long enough that Koa's guard had lowered enough for what came next to land with its full weight. I set down my chopsticks. Before we finish, I said, I want to give your father something for the anniversary, a kind of gift you might say, though it isn't really mine to give. It's simply the truth, finally arranged in one place. I rose from the table and walked to the altar, where I had placed, beneath a small cloth I now lifted away, the documents Mrs. Xuan had prepared. I picked them up and turned to face my son. Mom, what is this? Koa said, his voice already tightening, already sensing that whatever comfortable rhythm we had settled into was about to break. I did not answer him directly. Instead, I looked at Ngi. 3 years ago, I said, a woman used a different name to convince a young widow's daughter to invest in a scheme that never existed. The case was dismissed for lack of documentation. I wonder if you remember her, Ngi. I understand she had a very particular way of tilting her head when she smiled. The color drained from Ngi's face so completely that even Koa turned to look at her, confusion beginning to cloud his features. I set the first document on the table. The photograph the young man at the shop had sharpened, Ngi's face clear enough now that no one in the room could pretend otherwise. Beside it, I set the bank's security footage still, and beside that, Mrs. Xuan's formal handwriting analysis, and finally, the registry visitor log bearing both Ngi's signature and, directly beneath it, my son's. Mom is too old to keep that money anyway, I said quietly, repeating the words Koa had spoken in this very kitchen weeks earlier, words I had carried silently in my chest every day since. That's what you told her, Koa, wasn't it? That I was too old. Too old to notice a forged signature I spent 40 years learning to detect on prescriptions. Too old to notice a dented fender on the car that drove your girlfriend to my bank. Too old to notice my own son's name signed as a witness to a document meant to steal the roof over my head. The kitchen had gone completely silent. Mr. Tuan sat very still, his eyes moving carefully between the documents and Koa's face. Mrs. Xuan folded her hands in her lap, calm, patient, the way she must have once sat in courtrooms watching liars unravel beneath the weight of their own paper trails. You're wrong, Koa said, but his voice had already lost its footing, already cracked at the edges. You don't understand what you're looking at. I understand exactly what I'm looking at, I said. I understand it better than anyone at this table, because I spent 40 years reading things people didn't want me to read, a wrong dosage hidden behind a doctor's rushed handwriting, a counterfeit label on a bottle that was supposed to save someone's life instead of end it. This, I gestured to the document spread across the table where his father's memorial meal still sat half-finished, is no different. It's just harder, because this time the forgery has your name on it instead of a stranger's. Ngi stood abruptly, her chair scraping hard against the floor. This is insane. You can't prove any of this actually. I can, Mr. Tuan said quietly, and it was the first time he had spoken since arriving. Every head turned toward him. I've reviewed the security footage myself, along with the transaction history on Mrs. Ngo's account. The bank has already begun its own formal investigation into the forged withdrawal. This isn't speculation. I looked at my son, at the man who had once ridden a bicycle down our lane with his father running behind him, trusting he would learn to catch himself before he fell too far. "You didn't need to hurt me for this house, Koa," I said, and for the first time since this had all begun, I let my voice soften, let the grief beneath the evidence finally show itself. "I would have given you almost anything you asked for, honestly. All you had to do was ask." He said nothing. He only stared at the documents on the table, at his own signature staring back up at him beside hers. Undeniable, unforgivable, exactly where he had placed it himself. For a long moment after I finished speaking, no one at the table moved. The incense on the altar had burned low, its thin gray thread curling upward into the quiet, and I watched my son's eyes move once more across the documents spread before him, as though reading them again might somehow change what they said. It was Nhi who broke first. "This wasn't my idea," she said, and her voice had lost every trace of the warmth she had always used in my kitchen. It came out sharp now, defensive, the voice of someone already calculating how to survive what was happening rather than someone concerned with what was true. Hoa came to me. He was the one who said his mother had money just sitting there doing nothing. He was the one who suggested using the paperwork you already trusted him with. Koa's head snapped toward her. "What are you talking about? You're the one who forged the signature. You're the one with the contact at the private lending office. I never would have known how to do any of this. You knew exactly what we were doing every single time." Nhi shot back, standing now, her chair pushed further away from the table as though distance might somehow separate her from the evidence still sitting there in plain view. "You signed the registry log yourself. Don't sit there acting like your hands are clean. I only signed because you told me it was standard witnessing procedure, that it didn't mean anything. You knew what it meant." I sat and watched them, my son and the woman he had chosen, turn on each other across the very table where his father used to sit every Lunar New Year with his reading glasses low on his nose, saying the same quiet words each time. "Enough for tomorrow, Lua. Not much, but enough." I do not think either of them, in that moment, remembered I was still in the room at all. Grief and fury have a way of making people forget an audience even when the audience is the very person they wronged. "You told me she'd never notice," Koa said, his voice climbing now, cracking at the edges the way it had cracked once before, at his father's funeral, though this crack carried none of that earlier grief's honesty. "You said the signature was perfect. You said no one would ever compare it that closely. She's a pharmacist, Koa. You told me yourself she used to catch forged prescriptions for a living. I told you that was a risk from the very beginning, and you said it didn't matter. You said she trusted you too much to ever suspect." "Stop," I said quietly. They both fell silent, turning toward me as though startled to remember I was there. I looked at my son for a long moment, at the version of him sitting across from me now, stripped of every careful, rehearsed kindness he had performed in this kitchen these past months. This was the truth of him, finally, without the folder, without the brochure, without the patient explanations about what was best for a mother he had already decided was more burden than blessing. "You told her I trusted you too much to ever suspect," I said. "You were right about that, once. I did trust you too much. I trusted you the way I trusted your father, without needing proof, because that is how I was raised to love the people who belong to me." I paused, letting the words settle into the quiet kitchen. "But trust, Hoa, is not the same as blindness. I noticed the signature within days. I noticed the deed within weeks. Everything you and Engi built so carefully. I built my answer to it just as carefully, and I built it while you both still believed I was simply too old to see what was happening in my own house." Mr. Tuan cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. No. Given everything laid out here today, and given that the bank's internal investigation is already underway independently of anything discussed at this table, I have an obligation to report this formally. I'd like your permission to contact the district police this afternoon." "You have it," I said. Koa's face went pale in a way I had not seen since he was a small boy running a high fever, back when I sat beside his bed all night pressing cool cloths to his forehead, terrified in the particular way only a mother can be terrified. "Mom, please. Whatever you're thinking of doing, please, just think about what this does to the family, to how it looks. People will know the truth," I said. "That's all that will happen. The truth is not something to be afraid of unless you've spent months building your life on top of a lie." Nhi had already begun gathering her things, her movements quick, jerky, the movements of someone whose careful performance had finally, completely, run out of road. I want a lawyer before anyone says another word. That would be wise, Mrs. Swan said mildly from her chair by the window, the first thing she had said in several minutes, and something in her calm, unhurried tone made Ngi flinch as though she had been struck. Koa did not move toward the door the way Ngi did. He sat there instead, staring down at the table, at his father's half-finished bowl of bitter melon soup still sitting where I had placed it that morning, steam long since faded, and for one moment, one single unguarded moment, I saw something crumble behind his eyes that had nothing to do with fear of arrest or fear of exposure. Dad would be ashamed of me, he said, so quietly I almost did not hear it. Yes, I said, because there was no comfort left in me to soften that truth, not after everything, not while his father's photograph watched us both from across the room, patient and unchanged, the way it had watched every year on this same anniversary. He would be. But I am not your father, Koa, and I am not interested in shame for its own sake. I am interested in this house remaining mine, and in the money your father and I spent 40 years saving remaining what it was always meant to be, a foundation, not a target. Ngi was already at the door, her heels sharp against the floor, refusing to look back. Koa rose slowly, unsteadily, like a man who had aged a decade in the span of one conversation, and he paused there in the doorway of the house he grew up in, looking back at me one last time before he followed her out into the afternoon light. He did not apologize again. Perhaps he understood, finally, that an apology spoken only after being caught was worth exactly as much as the forged signature that had started all of this. I sat alone at the table after they left, Mr. Tuan already on the phone in a low, careful voice near the window, Mrs. Chuan quietly gathering the documents back into her portfolio, and I looked once more at Duke's photograph across the room, at his familiar half-smile, and I felt, beneath the exhaustion and the grief, something else finally beginning to settle into place. Not victory, exactly, something quieter than that, something that felt, more than anything, like the storm had finally broken, and I was still standing. The investigation took 4 months to complete. I will not pretend those months were easy. There were long afternoons at the district police station, answering the same questions in slightly different orders, and there were harder afternoons still, sitting across from Miss Trang as she explained, gently, what the coming weeks would require of me. Ngi was formally charged with forgery and fraud. Once the earlier case Mrs. Hoa's cousin's daughter had filed was reopened alongside mine, and 2 other families came forward once the story became known in certain quiet circles. Families who had lost far more than I had, and simply never known where to bring their suspicion. Koa was charged as well. For his role in the falsified registry filing, though because he had signed rather than forged, and because I chose, in the end, not to press for the harshest possible outcome, his sentence came with the possibility of an earlier release, conditioned on restitution and several years of supervised accountability. I did not do this for revenge. I want that understood clearly, because I have watched enough grief curdle into bitterness over the years to know the difference between the two, and I was determined not to let mine curdle. I did it because a lifetime of measuring careful doses had taught me that the wrong amount of anything, even justice, even love, can turn from medicine into poison if you are not careful how you administer it. The house remains mine. The property registry corrected itself once Mrs. Schwann's analysis and the police findings were entered into the record, and the private loan Hoa had secured against it, using a signature that was never truly mine, was voided entirely once the fraud was established. I still sleep in the same bedroom where he was born. I still trip, occasionally, on the uneven floor tile in the kitchen corner his father insisted on laying himself, and I have never once considered fixing it. Koa writes to me now, twice a month, from the facility where he is completing his sentence. His letters are different from anything he ever said to me at that kitchen table during the months I now think of, privately, as the storm. They are shorter, less certain of themselves. He does not ask about money anymore, not once, in any letter. And there is something in that absence that tells me more than any apology could. In his most recent letter, he wrote about a program at the facility that teaches basic accounting and financial literacy to people preparing to re-enter ordinary life, and he mentioned, almost shyly, that he had begun helping some of the older men there with simple paperwork, reading contracts aloud, explaining terms they did not understand. I do not know yet what to make of this. 8 years of grief and 8 months of betrayal have taught me not to trust a single gesture too quickly, however hopeful it looks on paper. But I read that letter 3 times, sitting at my kitchen table in the late afternoon light, and I allowed myself, cautiously, the smallest possibility that something honest might still be growing somewhere inside the man I raised, buried beneath everything that went wrong. I visit him once a month, on the second Sunday, taking the early bus so I can be home again before dark. We do not talk about Ngi. We do not talk about the house, or the money, or the folder she once carried into my kitchen like a knife hidden in a sleeve. We talk instead about small things. His father's old fountain pen, which I finally gave to him properly, through the facility's approved channels, along with a short note that said only, "Your father believed people could always start over, if they were willing to do the slow work of it." We talk about the tamarind tree, which bloomed unusually early this year, and about the neighbor's cat that has taken to sleeping on my front step every evening at dusk, as though the house itself has decided to keep some quiet company through these long months. I never sold the deed, and I never will, Miss. Trang helped me draft a proper will instead, the real kind, the honest kind, one that states plainly what will happen to this house, and whatever remains of Duke's and my savings when I am gone. Most of it will go to Koa, eventually, should he complete his sentence and continue on the path his letters suggest he may finally be choosing. Not because I have forgotten what happened at this table, but because his father built this house believing in the boy Hoa once was, and I have decided, in my own slow, careful way, that I am not yet ready to stop believing that boy might still exist somewhere beneath the man who tried to take everything from me. A portion, though, a portion I have set aside separately, will go to a small fund Miss Trang helped me establish, one that provides free legal consultation to elderly people in this district who suspect, the way I once suspected, that something in their own family has quietly gone wrong. I named it, simply, the Duke Fund, after a man who used to say enough for tomorrow, not much, but enough, every single year of our marriage, never once imagining how many other families might need to hear those same words from someone willing to help them protect what little tomorrow they had left. I still light incense every morning and every evening before his photograph. The smoke still rises the same way it always has, thin and gray, catching the 4 o'clock light exactly where he used to sit with his tea, and some evenings, when the house is very quiet and the tamarind leaves are moving softly outside the window, I sit there and tell him everything that happened, the way I have told him everything for 8 years now, trusting that wherever he is, some part of him is still listening, the way he always listened, patient, a little amused, as if he already knew how the story would end before I ever finished telling it. My grandmother used to take my hand when I was small and say, "Still water runs deepest, Khan. The river that makes no sound is the one you should never turn your back on." I understood those words, finally and fully, the year my own son called me too old to be trusted with my own life, and I have carried them with me every day since, through the forged signature, through the falsified deed, through the long quiet months of gathering evidence. No one around me knew I was gathering at all, but I have come to understand something more now. Sitting here in the house, Duke and I built board by board, watching the incense smoke rise into the evening air. Still, water does not only hide what is dangerous beneath its surface. It also holds what is patient, what is careful, what refuses to be rushed into breaking, simply because the world above it has grown loud and cruel and impatient, with an old woman's silence. I was never simply the water they thought they saw. I was always the depth underneath it, waiting, the way I had always waited, for the moment when stillness would finally tell the truth loud enough for everyone to hear. To every parent who has ever been told they were too old, too slow, too much of a burden to be trusted with their own life, you are not invisible, and you are not finished. Age does not erase a lifetime of wisdom, and love should never be measured by what someone thinks they can take from you. Still waters run deepest, and sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones paying the closest attention. If this story moved you, give it a like, and subscribe for more stories about the strength it takes to stand up for yourself, no matter your age. If you were in Lua's place, would you have given your son a second chance? Or is trust something that can only be broken once?